Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation on class and sociolinguistics. Now, as we've discussed in class, linguistic variations help index our identities and other identities across different contexts. However, a less visible dimension of our identities is our social class. So before I kind of continue with the presentation, I just want you to think for a little bit about how you might, or if you might, index your own social class through your language, or how you kind of make sense of other people's social class by the way that they speak. Now, before I kind of get into the meat of the presentation, I kind of want to quickly cover the erasure of social class in sociolinguistics. So essentially, kind of across social sciences, in politics, in sociology, the kind of relevancy of class as a kind of concept and also as like a part of identity has kind of been going out of fashion kind of the last 50 years or so. And this kind of happens to coincide with the popularity of kind of new theories and new perspectives like the post-structuralist or postmodernist theories that kind of look back at kind of modernity and kind of consider the group categories, the kind of identities and the scripts that kind of people kind of could make sense of their lives. Like, for example, within gender, within class, within race. Often these were kind of tied to religion. So these kind of fixed scripts kind of made life quite kind of predictable. But then, people that hail from kind of the post kind of scholarships, they kind of look at the globalized world and they look at the kind of speed of change and the kind of variety of identities that people have to kind of pick and choose and to try on in kind of different spaces that are really different from each other, and suggest that the kind of identities such as class that were really kind of pertinent in this modern time are no longer kind of as relevant. And kind of sociologists like Ulrich Beck kind of contribute to that kind of understanding, because they suggest that where we used to kind of understand ourselves as part of collectives, kind of part of these societies that were that kind of relied on one another, we now kind of understand ourselves as individuals, or through the individualized kind of paradigm. And this kind of, when we bring in class, it's kind of relevant to then bring in the popularity, or the growing popularity of new economic systems like neoliberalism, which kind of look at people's life chances or their kind of economic situation as a result of their individual kind of decisions. Whether if somebody's more impoverished, often people kind of look at that as their decision or their laziness or their kind of inability, and that's kind of reflected in how many people look at things like welfare or kind of social institutions. And I suppose on the inverse of that is people who are rich believe that they've kind of got there because they've worked hard, or because they're kind of inherently smart, or whatever that might be. But kind of bringing back to linguistics, or the kind of social constructivist kind of position that kind of understands, gender, for example, that kind of understands that rather than gender acting upon individuals are using linguistic resources which are indirectly indexed as gendered. And so that kind of, I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is that the problem is that it negates how kind of socioeconomic forces are interacting or affecting, the creation of identities, or the kind of production of language and the linguistic variations within. And so it's kind of, I think, a fallacy to suggest that, we exist purely, in hyperlocalized spaces, or we exist, in a totally mobile society. So by kind of thinking that way and then looking at how social class has lost its kind of relevancy within research, you can kind of begin to understand the more extreme arguments like Hart and Negri's, who kind of suggest that middle-class academics, by kind of focusing on the fragmentation of identity and other elements of our social identity, they're kind of obfuscating the importance of working class kind of issues and kind of socioeconomic issues. And by doing so, they're kind of falling into line with the neo-market rationale. Okay, so next I just want to talk about the main class theories and how they kind of interact or how they relate to sociolinguistics. While kind of the majority of the class theories all kind of hail, or at least they draw from the Marxist scholarships, other kind of notable, pretty legendary theorists like Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, or Pierre Bourdieu all kind of contributed to our understandings of class that go a little bit beyond, just capital, or rather like, cash or, means of production, etc., etc. So the most kind of relevant, in our discussions of sociolinguistics is certainly Pierre Bourdieu, who in Distinction kind of discussed how social class was produced and reproduced through capital symbolically, or through symbolic capital, social capital, and cultural capital. And so our social capital is essentially just like our social network, and it's basically the net amount of resources that we can kind of mobilize. So it's like, it might be our family, our friends that we can kind of draw from to kind of get us different kind of positions. And this is like a really important one for mobility. Symbolic capital is like, things like our degrees that kind of, symbolize our kind of class status. But the third and most important is cultural capital, which is kind of, you think about it as kind of assets that we kind of are socialized into, or we develop from our parents, and they're kind of determined by our class. So they're kind of like things like our education, our tastes, our language, our, style. These kind of things all begin to confer a kind of a social status or a kind of position within a hierarchy. And these also are kind of part of what Bourdieu calls our habitus, which is like the dispositions that, as I said, we kind of are socialized into as kids, and they kind of determine who we can relate to. So that's why, often working class kids will become friends, or will have similarities with other working class kids. And that is kind of how this social class is reproduced. And it's also important to remember that different types of capitals can be converted to other types of capital. Like, getting higher cultural capital by kind of getting degrees can then be converted into a higher paying job, and then you can get more, more money, etc., etc. And I think these kind of, lots of popular or interesting, cinema and things like that kind of discuss this issue. For example, I think there's a Woody Allen film or something or other that basically, you have a working class guy and a middle class guy in a art gallery. The working class guy's like, oh, this is, it's just great, it's great, it's great. And then the working class guy is super critical, and he says, this is banal, etc., etc. And it kind of shows the tastes, where middle class people are really critical of everything. So it just kind of shows that, within interactions and within contexts, our kind of dispositions, our habitus kind of determines how we and who we can relate to, and the kind of status or power that we have within an interaction. Anyway, other indexicality I'm actually going to talk a little bit about later, but it's just important to remember and to kind of keep thinking about how, different language, different lexicons and syntax all kind of index a person's class position. Like thinking, Kath and Kim, the way that they talk kind of indexes the kind of position they are within, the Australian hierarchy. Anyway, some other really kind of important researchers, or, some research that I found really interesting was Basil Bernstein, which was kind of, he wrote in kind of competition with Lobov, and they were both, quite concerned with how middle or working class kids were just kind of, there was a trend that working class kids would do poorly at school, when compared to middle class kids. And they kind of, their explanations kind of differed a bit, but they ultimately kind of, they suggested that, working class kids, the socialization of speech would put them at a significant disadvantage within education. And ultimately that kind of line of thinking was kind of pigeonholed into a deficit model, and as we've seen through, the linguistic kind of discourse has kind of gone beyond those deficit or domination models into the more social constructivist views. And so the Bernstein, despite still being quite, being really relevant, was kind of a bit discredited as being a little bit reductive. But I think even a more important kind of and more relevant to us in Australia was research that Ruqaiya Hassan did in Sydney. And Hassan looked at working class families and middle class families and looked at the way that they kind of talked. And they found here in Sydney that middle class mothers would kind of treat and understand their kids as kind of extensions of themselves, and would kind of create this collective identity of really a family. And in doing so, in talking in those ways, their kids began to kind of see their future as cut from the same kind of cloth as their parents. And that kind of might explain, I just had a thought that that working class kind of linguistic kind of variation where kids might say give us that, or give us a go, compared to the kind of normative form, kind of might play into that. Anyway, I suppose also the more important part of this is that middle class families, when Hassan looked at the speech there, the middle class families encouraged children to create these kind of really individualized identities and to kind of pursue individualized ideas that were respected and discussed. And when the mothers would talk to their children, they'd talk in these long discursive stories, kind of beginning with the observable kind of world of the child, but then kind of discursively kind of moving between systems of knowledge which kind of look through history, transcending time and space. So it's this kind of decontextualized language that mirrors the language that's used in kind of pedagogical systems like education, and it kind of explains why the middle class kids do so much better, because they found that these middle class kids had already had this experience with this decontextualized language, and then thus explaining why they did better. She also later then went on to find that teachers sound distinctly like middle class mothers, or sorry, rather female teachers sounded distinctly like middle class mothers. Anyway, the point kind of stands. While we discussed before that class has become much less visible in the construction of our identities, for example, you rarely hear somebody say or attach working class or middle class or even bourgeois or proletariat to our identities. But that's not to say that class isn't still relevant. It's just now that class or kind of class associations are created through stereotypes. And, for example, in England, they have the chav, or in Australia, we have terms like the bogan, or kind of even more recent ones like eshe or lad, that all index working class identities. And there's kind of two arguments, or two kind of main points that come out of this. The first one is that often by kind of by making relevant these terms like bogan, we're indexing various kind of undesirable kind of class-related qualities. So that might be kind of uneducated, uncultured, lazy, all these kind of different terms that are different ways in which the working class are demonized through stereotypes. The second one is kind of, perhaps a little bit more subtle, but equally is kind of scary. And if we look at the tables here, we have a kind of, a satire of, on the one hand, we have slang or, bogan speak, and then on the right side, we have the kind of translation or the meaning. And by doing this, what we're kind of suggesting is that working class speech is the non-normative variation of English, and middle class speech or proper English is the kind of norm. But by stereotyping and by kind of stigmatizing, by satirizing it, it puts into question what kind of ideological beliefs we have about kind of working class or non-standard variations of English speech. Something that is quite interesting about Australia is our alleged classlessness. And while economically we have kind of great wealth inequality, our cultural beliefs kind of suggests on the one hand we have stereotypes for working class identities, but on the other we also have stereotypes for middle class identities. And I suppose the hipster stereotype is ultimately a parody of people who cleave too tightly to middle class norms in their pursuit of authentic and individual identities. Using this week's topic on power and linguistic variation, we understand that politeness is a performance of the expected behaviour norms within culture. However, if we actually interrogate what is constitutive of these norms and ask where they come from or what ideologies they serve, we can begin to think a little bit more critically about the ways that oppression, inequality, and power operate within them. According to some interesting articles by Mills and Allen, for example, the expected politeness norms within Western cultures are that of the middle and upper class politeness norms. So this means that if a working class person does not conform to the middle class politeness norms within neutral situations, or interactions rather, their speech and identity are not equally valued. Moreover, if we think about the locations of power within our society, I'm thinking institutions like the courts or in politics or in prestigious jobs like medicine, the expected politeness norms are really quite upper class. And so this is a way that essentially the middle class or the upper class can gatekeep power and kind of capital, if you will, from the working class. I think an interesting kind of satire of this is the whole Judge Judy show, in which we're kind of seen to make a mockery of really working class folks within a location or within an interaction rather, where the politeness norms are, quite middle class, and we kind of laugh at their inability to conform to them. Now, lastly, considering this week's article on intersectionality and labeling processes, and then thinking back to the erasure of social class in research, I suppose it's no great surprise that Wong omits class from his intersectional methodology. And while I know it's not always pertinent or important within the research, I think at least on the identity kind of production side of intersectionality, I know at least anecdotally for me, the toolbox, the theories, the frameworks, and kind of understanding my own identity was all kind of afforded to me by my degree at university. Whereas I think for folks from a working class background, without that privilege, as researchers understanding, how working class identities are created is kind of maybe just as important or needs to be kind of researched more. And if we can kind of consider that these folks might be perhaps more vulnerable to the other oppressions that are kind of come with the different intersections that are being studied, such as Wong's, I think we can kind of understand why, some folks like Nancy Fraser, who is suggesting that class needs to be foregrounded in these studies, especially considering that inequality, wealth inequality is becoming greater and greater within our society and looks like it's only going to get more and more that way. Anyway, thank you so much to those who got this far. I think ultimately what I hope you got from this presentation is maybe just a thought to kind of think a little bit about class in considering the ideas of identity and of linguistics and in sociolinguistics, because I think while it might becoming less visible, the effects of socioeconomic inequality are, if not the same, far more kind of relevant and damaging to people at the moment. And I think, because of its, visibility as, budding academics that we are, it's kind of our job to pick up the bill in studying these things and thinking a little bit more critically about how social class is affecting, the way that we talk or, the way that we are. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you have a relaxing and wonderful week.